Can I ask you about climate change?
Yeah.
And your read on that? Big debate right now, global warming, human-made. How do you see what's actually happening here?
Scam. I mentioned earlier an organization called the Club of Rome. Club of Rome was started in 1968, and it's part of a network of organizations. Towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, secret society was created in Britain called the Round Table. The first head of it was Cecil Rhodes, who was a Rothschild agent. That's why he went into southern Africa and pillaged the gold and diamond resources and destroyed that society on behalf of the Rothschilds. And he was the head of the Round Table. Then when he died, another guy called Alfred Milner took over, another Rothschild agent. And this secret society started spawning satellite organizations. First one they created was the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, also known as Chatham House. Think tanks, this is what they are. Watch the think tanks, big time. And then they created something in America, which was an American version of that, called the Council on Foreign Relations. Council on Foreign Relations has, to a very large extent, driven American foreign policy ever since to this day. Then came the Bilderberg Group in 1954, formed at the Bilderberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, Holland. Then in 1968 came the Club of Rome, and then came the Trilateral Commission in 72, 73. Now, the Club of Rome was created specifically to use the environment as an excuse to transform society. And I've been writing about this for a long time. And basically, you say, to save the planet, this has to happen. And to save the planet, it's a globe, therefore we have to have global centralization of power to save the planet. And so the Club of Rome has been one of the big drivers of human-caused climate change, or the illusion of it. And then came a United Nations agenda called Agenda 21. And that laid out a strategy for transforming society to meet the challenge of climate change. It was everything that they wanted. And then later, more recently, they've advanced that, and they call it now Agenda 2030, which is an updated version of the same thing. And when you read Agenda 2030, it is a tyranny's dream, because it dictates every area of human life, including education, to save the planet. And this is problem, reaction, solution, as I call it. And this has been worked towards for a long time. So you create the illusion of the problem, and then you offer the solutions to the problem, which is centralization of power, centralized control. Now, bringing it up to date, one of the most classic Soros progressives around today is a lady in America, a congresswoman, she's recently elected, called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's classic, nothing to do with facts, just this is how it is. And she's just come out now, and it's got a lot of coverage in America, a lot of support in the Democratic Party, called the Green New Deal. Because she says, I would say bizarrely, and scientists would also say bizarrely too, that we have 12 years to save the planet. We had a few years to save the planet some years back, and it long passed and we're still here. And what her Green New Deal demands is exactly what I've been writing for years, is the plan to transform human society into a centralized dictatorship on the justification of we have to do this to save the planet.
And we don't need to save the planet.
No.
And humans aren't causing an aggressive form of global warming.
No, the
that's hurting us.
planet, the planet doesn't need saving. I mean, its natural balance mechanisms will kick us off before it needs any help.
But are we going to harm ourselves more in the meantime?
No, I've just been reading. See, it's a psychological game. So you have a major weather event in the 1950s, and it's a major weather event. Oh yeah, well that was a bit extreme, wasn't it? You have one now, global warming, it's climate change. And I've just been reading a very, very interesting book by an American meteorologist called Joe Bastardi, who is, since he was a little kid, he was obsessed with the weather. He just loves weather and weather forecasting, and he's just really kind of obsessed with it. And he was observing all this. And being obsessed with the weather, he's looked at charts going back forever, And he's looking at all these claims about this is global warming, this is climate change. And he's going, well, hold on a minute. That happened in the 1950s. That happened in the 1920s. And what he does in this book is he shows the repeating cycles that cause the outcome. So in the 1920s or earlier, there is a cycle where the Atlantic cools and the Pacific warms. There's another cycle where the Pacific cools and the Atlantic warms. And that has a knock-on effect that eventually reaches a weather outcome. Now, he's pointing out in this book that when this sequence happens today, the outcome is, that's climate change, we're all going to die. And then he goes back in his book and he shows that in the 1950s, the 1940s, this same cycle happened, and the outcome that he's now blamed on climate change happened. I mean, the planet today is nothing like as warm as it was in what they call the medieval warm period, when there was no carbon dioxide emissions from technology. I mean, what caused it then? Turbocharged handcarts? I mean, it's crazy. And the other thing is that we went from this really warm period, the medieval warm period, about 1,000 years ago, and then we came down into what they call the Little Ice Age, which is still portrayed today on some Christmas cards with people skating on the Thames, when temperatures became very, very cold. And there's a correlation between the two, which I'll come to in a second. And then we started coming out of the Little Ice Age into the present day. And a lot of, they say, this is the warmest day since records began. A lot of those records began, well, we're still coming out of the Little Ice Age. So the comparison between then and now is completely unsupportable. Have you noticed that whenever they're talking about the climate and climate change and global warming, they never mention the bloody sun. They don't mention it. It's all carbon dioxide. But by the way, without carbon dioxide, we'd all be dead. It's what gives life to the planet. And another, by the way, 98% or thereabouts of greenhouse gases, which are supposed to hold the heat in, or do hold the heat in, is water vapor and clouds. And when you see the graph, there's water vapor and clouds. Here's carbon dioxide. And the vast majority of this carbon dioxide is naturally generated, not human generated. And
what about methane and all the ones by animals?
Yeah, but they're tiny, tiny,
but
tiny.
It has a big effect, though.
They're even less. What are we do? Going to kill all the animals? What are we going to do? Legislate against condensation when 98% of it's caused by water vapor? It's ridiculous.
So it's another scam to get people's attention, to create control.
But like I was just going to say, they never talk about the sun. Now, it's well known that solar activity, these great emissions of power, which we experience as heat, coming from the sun, you can see when the sun is in an up period of, if you like, power, by the number of sunspots. Because these sunspots are massive projections from the sun that are bigger than the Earth, well bigger than the Earth. And they travel through on the solar wind, and we get them as heat. And so when the sun is very inactive, there's very few sunspots, sometimes virtually none. And these have been looked at in their cycles through this period that I'm talking about. And when we reached the minimum, the bottom of the Little Ice Age, when it was at its coldest, it's known in climate science as the Maunder minimum. And it's named after a guy called Maunder, and his wife was there as well, who were charting sunspot activity and its relationship to Earth temperature. And they picked up a correlation. And one of the correlations was that when there was virtually no sunspot activity, we reached the coldest point of the Maunder minimum, the Little Ice Age, as they call it. And then sunspot activity started again, and we started to climb out of this Little Ice Age into present day. So when you discount basically the impact of the sun on temperature, your climate models are irrelevant. Irrelevant, because the basic foundation factor of what dictates the temperature of the planet, the flipping sun, is not taken into account on anything like what it should be to get an accurate projection of what's going to happen. Then you look at this from the point of view of prediction against experience. According to Al Gore, well before now, there should be basically no ice in the summer at the North Pole. Funnily enough, there is. And this should have happened, and that should have happened. And another thing that Joe Bastardi points out in his kind of lifelong love of weather is that we're told that all these extreme weather events now are increasing because of climate change. He's saying they're not. They're not increasing. There were more tornadoes and hurricanes way back than there are now. And there were more extreme weather events than we have now. But because it's a psychological game, if you keep saying every time, notice what they've done now in Britain, which they've never done before, they've started naming storms. Like they name hurricanes, which are kind of not very often, so you just name a few. They must be running out of names. Because every time there's a storm that you would call, it's a bit more than, it's going to be a bit rough, they give it a name.
All right, so it's another psychological tactic.
It's more scary.
All right, so we need to ignore it.
Well, what we need to do is to research ourselves beyond the official narrative. And if we do, we'll find an amazing thing, that there are a lot of scientists, increasing all the time, by the way, who are saying, actually, it's not happening, is it? It's not real, is it? There's many, many scientists now that were on the bandwagon, it's happening, and we're now saying, well, actually, I'm reassessing it. I don't think it is now. I don't think this is real. And all that is available if you search for it. But when you've got a situation where the BBC, that's supposed to be this neutral organization, well, it's the way I tell them, that actually made a decision that the science is settled, therefore we're not having people on that are saying otherwise, then what you're doing again, back to the same theme, you're skewing the debate. Because all people are hearing is climate change is real. If they don't go searching elsewhere, climate change is real, we're all going to die. You are disgustingly, mercilessly frightening young children of the devastation and the horror that they're going to face for a political agenda. That's what's happening. So and the school, I mean, my son, Jamie, because he thinks for himself, when he was at school, and he had an exam, and part of the exam was climate change. he was obviously going to put that actually there's evidence to say that it's actually not happening. And his teacher said, well, I have sympathy with that, but if you say that, you won't pass, right? So again, wherever you look, where there's an agenda, you can't win. You don't have the agenda, or you don't have the debate. So what you have now is anyone that is questioning the official narrative of so-called global warming, climate change, and it became climate change, by the way, when the temperatures leveled out and they couldn't call it global warming anymore. They're now climate deniers, which is obviously psychologically linking to Holocaust deniers, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you only hear one thing, that's overwhelmingly going to be the perception you have. Okay. And if you say to people, well, why do you believe that climate change caused by humans is real? They'll say, well, everybody knows that. Well, everybody knows that because that's all everyone's ever heard. When you go and do the research, you find actually it's a house of cards. It's just based on repetition. You know, go and research. The 97% of scientists believe that global warming is caused by humans. Go and research that, and you'll find, if you follow it back, it's based on wind. It's based on no substance whatsoever. It's a complete hoax, but it's a great line. Oh, 97% of scientists agree that it's caused by humans. Oh, well, if 97% of scientists agree, it must be true. You chart that number back and see where it came from. Even the Wall Street Journal trashed that.
Okay.
But it's still parroted all the time as justification for transforming human society, destroying beautiful landscapes with wind farms that are incredibly inefficient, and so on.